In 1951, Birmingham, England reached its industrial peak, a population of 1,112,685. It was Britain's second city. It was the workshop of the world. It was, for 2 centuries, the city of 1,000 trades. Guns, buttons, bicycles, motorcars, all of it made within a few square miles of workshops that never stopped. Today, the council that governs that same city has declared itself unable to pay its bills. On the 5th of September 2023, Birmingham City Council issued a Section 114 notice, the closest thing English local government has to a declaration of bankruptcy. Behind the notice sat an equal pay liability of up to £760 million. A city that once measured its output in 1,000 trades now measures its survival in a single number it cannot afford. The distance between those two facts is where this story begins. Chapter 1. A town without a shackle. Birmingham had no coalfield beneath its streets, and no navigable river running through its centre, the 2 accidents of geology that had built most of England's earlier industrial towns. What Birmingham had instead was an accident of governance, and it turned out to matter more. The town was governed as a manor, not as a chartered borough, and the distinction was not a technicality. A chartered borough came with guilds, and guilds came with rules. Who could open a workshop? Who could train an apprentice? Who could sell a finished good within the town walls? Birmingham had none of that machinery. No guild-controlled entry, no livery company set the terms of a trade. No apprenticeship system stood at the door of the town and decided who was permitted to work and who was not. A smith, a nonconformist entrepreneur, a skilled worker fleeing a stricter town down the road, any of them could simply arrive in Birmingham and begin trading the same afternoon. The freedom had a specific origin. In 1166, a minor landholder named Peter de Birmingham bought a market charter from Henry II, and the market it created ran on open terms from the start. After 1536, there was no resident lord of the manor left to enforce even the loose obligations that remained. Nobody was left to say no. The historian William Hutton, writing more than 2 centuries later, put the whole arrangement into a single sentence that Birmingham would spend the rest of its history proving true. A town without a charter is a town without a shackle. What grew out of that openness was not one industry, but hundreds of small ones, packed into workshops the size of front parlours, each employing a handful of men and boys and turning out goods too small to need a factory. By the middle of the 18th century, the trade that defined the town was known misleadingly as the toy trade. Not children's toys, but small worked metal goods. Buckles, buttons, snuff boxes, trinkets, the 1,000 cheap ornaments of Georgian dress and Georgian vanity. By 1759, some 20,000 people in Birmingham worked in the toy trade in one form or another, 8,000 of them in the buckle trade alone. In 1777, Edmund Burke stood before Parliament and called Birmingham the great toy shop of Europe. Nobody who had walked its streets thought the phrase an exaggeration. The fuel that fed those workshops came from the same pattern of proximity without ownership. The town sat at the margin of the South Staffordshire coalfield, where a single seam, 30 feet thick, the thickest in Britain, worked by the pits and forges of the district already known as the Black Country, lay within reach but not underfoot. On the 6th of November 1769, the engineer James Brindley's Birmingham Canal carried the first coal into the town by water, and the workshops that had been paying premium prices for fuel hauled overland suddenly had it delivered to their back doors. The network grew from there, canal joining canal, until it ran to something like 160 miles of navigable water, threading through a town that owned no river of its own. A system sometimes compared to Venice's, depending how you count. By the time the toy trade had matured into something larger, Birmingham was already what it would remain for the next 2 centuries. Not a company town built around a single mill, but a city assembled out of hundreds of small workshops, each one independent, each one replaceable, each one somebody's whole livelihood. 1,000 trades, the saying would eventually go, not one furnace and one fortune, hundreds of small fires all going at once. Chapter 2. Soho. Matthew Bolton was born in 1728. He came into adulthood in a place with no guild to license him, no charter to answer to, no lord of the manor left to tell him where he could build, and in 1761 he leased 13 acres of scrubland at Soho in the parish of Handsworth, on the edge of the town those hundreds of small fires had built. By 1766, the Soho manufactory stood on the site. and it stood at a scale nothing in the toy trade had approached before it. More than 500 workers under a single roof, making buttons, buckles, ormolu, and silver plate. Buttons for coats that would travel to London, buckles for shoes that would travel further. Ormolu, gilded bronze fittings, bound for the drawing rooms of people who would never once think about the building that made them. Birmingham until then had built its reputation on hundreds of workshops of a handful of men apiece. A bench, a boy, a small fire. Soho answered to one name, one gate, one set of accounts. It was not a workshop. It was a system. 500 people, and every one of them practicing a trade Birmingham had already spent a century perfecting. Bolton built his own house at the edge of the works and called it Soho House. From its windows he could watch the yard fill every morning and empty every night. Enter James Watt. He was a Scottish engineer born in 1736, and the engine he had designed did something no engine built before it had managed. It used far less fuel than the pumping engines already at work in mines across the country. Earlier engines cooled the cylinder with every stroke, then paid in coal to heat it again before the next one could run. Watt's engine used a separate vessel to condense the steam, keeping the cylinder itself hot throughout, and the saving in fuel was not marginal. In 1775, the two men went into business together as Bolton and Watt, working out of the same manufactory at Soho that already made buttons and buckles and silver plate, and the firm did not build one engine or a dozen. It built hundreds of them. Engines that left Handsworth by canal and by road for factories, for mines, for mills that had never had a source of power beyond the two oldest ones available to anyone: moving water and animal muscle, factories, mines, mills, 3 different appetites for power and one engine, built in Handsworth, answering all 3. No more waiting for the river to run high enough. No more building a mill only where the current happened to be strong. No more herds of horses walking in circles from dawn to dusk to turn a shaft that never stopped needing to turn. A Bolton and Watt engine could stand wherever there was coal to feed it, and a customer willing to pay for the privilege, and after 1775 there was rarely a shortage of either. The mines that had always flooded past the point men and buckets could clear them now had a pump that did not tire. The mills that had always waited on the season and the rainfall now had a source of power that did not care what month it was. The town of small workshops, the town without a charter, had spent 2 centuries filling itself with metalworkers who could turn a drawing into a cylinder, bored true. Soho gave that skill an engine to build, and the engine gave the rest of the country a reason to stop, depending on the weather and the horse. Nobody in Handsworth in 1775 called it a revolution. It was simply an order book, and the order book kept growing. It began at Soho. Chapter 3. The Lunar Men. Bolton did not keep his circle to the factory floor. On the Sunday nearest the full moon, from roughly 1765 to 1813, a small group of men gathered to eat and argue in one another's houses around Birmingham and its edges, timing the meetings to the light because the roads home were dark, rutted, and safer to ride under a full moon than a new one, a practical reason for what history would remember as a poetic one. In time, they called themselves the Lunar Society. Bolton was there, Watt was there, Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin, was there. Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, rode down from his own works to join them, and Joseph Priestley, who in 1774 identified the gas the world would later call oxygen, sat at the same table. It was, without much exaggeration, the most important provincial gathering of scientific and industrial minds in Britain. It met not in a university or a Royal Society hall, but around a dinner table in the English Midlands. The town that produced that circle also produced the mob that came for one of its members. In July of 1791, a crowd moved through Birmingham and burned Joseph Priestley's house to the ground. They burned his laboratory with it, the instruments, the papers, years of research reduced to ash in a single evening, work that could not be rebuilt by cheque or by contract. Priestley fled the town that summer and never lived there again. Within a few years he had emigrated to America and did not come back. The circle that had gathered by moonlight to discuss the nature of matter and the future of manufacturing had, within its own town, one member burned out of his home for having explained what the air was made of. Nothing about the events of that July required comment, and Birmingham offered none. The mob dispersed. The town went back to work. Bolton by then had already built one more institution on the Soho grounds. In 1788, he founded the Soho Mint, the world's first steam-powered mint, striking coin with the same engines Watt had designed to pump water and turn wheels. Where a hammer and a man's arm had once struck coin one at a time, unevenly, the steam presses at Soho struck them by the thousand, each one identical to the one before it. In 1797, the Soho Mint struck Britain's first official copper penny, a coin heavy enough in the hand to earn the name cartwheel. More than 45 million of them left Soho within 2 years, carrying Bolton's steam power into the pockets of a country that had never held a coin made this way before. Around that circle and around the industries it fed, the town's trades hardened into named ground, the loose sprawl of workshops sorting itself, district by district, into specialties precise enough to put on a map. There was the gun quarter, where the Birmingham Proof House opened in 1813 and still tests firearms today. There was the jewellery quarter, a dense square mile of small workshops that would employ more than 20,000 people by 1914. And there was the pen trade, carried by Joseph Gillott, born in 1799, who mechanised the making of the steel nib and helped turn Birmingham into the world's centre for the steel pen. Guns, jewellery, pens, 3 trades, 3 districts, each one built on the same base of small workshops and skilled hands that had made the buckles and buttons a generation earlier. Of the 3, the jewellery quarter would prove the deepest rooted. It was not the largest trade Birmingham built in this period, and not the most famous, but it filled its square mile with workshops that answered to no single factory owner and no single product line. A district built on the same guild-free freedom that had let Bolton lease his 13 acres at Soho decades before. The gun quarter would prove the licence Birmingham needed. The pen trade would prove its own kind of world dominance. The jewellery quarter would prove the one that lasted. Chapter 4. The best governed city in the world. In 1801, Birmingham held 60,822 people. By 1851, it held 233,841. By 1901, it held 522,204. Not a village's numbers, not a market town's numbers. The numbers of a city that had outgrown every category built to describe it, decade after decade, in a line that climbed almost mechanically until 1911 broke it. That year, the Greater Birmingham annexation took the figure from 525,833 to 840,202 almost overnight. A jump that looked like growth but was mostly geography, boundaries redrawn faster than the population inside them could actually multiply. The city passed 1 million by 1931. It peaked at 1,112,685 in 1951, the largest it would ever be. The city built monuments to match the numbers. Birmingham Town Hall, a Roman temple designed by Joseph Hansom, opened in 1834 at a cost of £25,000. 45 years later, the council built itself an address to match. The council house opened in 1879 at a cost of £163,000. Not a merchant's folly, not a private company's headquarters, but the seat of a municipal government that had started to think of itself as something closer to a state. £138,000 separated the 2 buildings, and the difference tracked almost exactly the difference between a manufacturing town that wanted a hall to meet in and a manufacturing city that wanted to run itself. Joseph Chamberlain, born in 1836, was a screw manufacturer before he was anything else. A manufacturer who became the city's mayor in 1873 and held the office only 3 years until 1876, long enough to give the city a doctrine it would carry for the rest of its industrial life: the civic gospel. He was radical only in the sense Birmingham manufacturers already understood the word: methodical, thorough, unsentimental about half measures. The gospel had a simple accounting logic to it. Other cities left their gas and their water to private companies answerable to shareholders. Birmingham decided its own council would be the shareholder, and the shareholder would answer to the ratepayers instead. The council bought out the private gas companies in 1875. It bought the waterworks the same year for £1.3 million. The purchase completed on the 1st of January 1876. It drove Corporation Street through the slums beginning in 1878, a new commercial spine cut straight through the courts and back-to-backs that housed the manufacturer's own workforce. Chamberlain said the city would take its profit not in dividends but in the health of the inhabitants. A city that decided it should own the things its people could not live without: the gas, the water, the streets themselves. In 1890, an American journalist named Julian Ralph came through Birmingham for Harper's Magazine and wrote down the phrase that would outlive him: the best governed city in the world. Chamberlain had earned the reputation. Ralph only said it first, and said it in print in a magazine that took the comparison seriously. He was an outsider, writing for an audience an ocean away, measuring Birmingham against the cities he already knew, and finding it, plainly, better run. Benjamin Disraeli had used a related phrase in 1838, calling Britain as a whole the workshop of the world. By 1890, the phrase fit no single place in Britain better than it fit Birmingham, a city that made the tools other cities used to make everything else, and that now, apparently, governed itself better than anywhere else on earth. A city of 1,000 trades ruled by outside reckoning as carefully as any one of them. This was the council that had bought its own gas, bought its own water, and driven a street through its own slums without asking anyone's permission but its own. It was the council Julian Ralph had singled out in 1890 as the best governed in the world. It is the same council that appears again later, standing before its own creditors, the gas and the water, and the health of the inhabitants long since spent. The Victorian confidence that had paid for all of it, never once accounting for the arithmetic running in reverse. That council would, in time, be unable to pay its own bills. Chapter 5. Motor City. That reckoning was still decades away. While the council bought its gas mains and its water pipes and basked in Julian Ralph's verdict that it ran the best governed city in the world, Birmingham's trades were quietly changing shape underneath it. Not multiplying anymore, the way they had for a century of buckle makers and toy makers opening their own doors on their own schedules, but consolidating into something new and much larger. The city that had made its name on 1,000 small trades was about to make its fortune on a handful of enormous ones. In 1879, a family of Quaker manufacturers opened the Cadbury chocolate factory at Bourneville, 4 miles south of the city. From 1893, they began building a model village around it, streets of company-built cottages spreading across the estate, each one owned by the firm that also owned the wages that paid for it. Alcohol was banned on that land by the founder's own rule. It was an industrialist's idea of how workers ought to live, extending from the factory floor into the front garden and the parlour, a paternalism as deliberate in its way as Chamberlain's gas mains and water pipes had been. Around Bourneville, and increasingly beyond it, Birmingham's 1,000 small workshops were being absorbed into a handful of very large concerns. The Birmingham Small Arms Company had been formed in 1861 to make guns. It made bicycles next. It made motorcycles after that. By 1961, it was the largest motorcycle manufacturer on Earth. 17,000 people on its payroll, 3 products and a century of reinvention folded into one company badge. Dunlop's Fort Dunlop Works, built for a city and a country learning to move on rubber instead of iron, employed 10,000 by 1954. Joseph Lucas's electrical firm wired the ignition and the lighting of nearly every car built in Britain. One Birmingham name reaching into almost every vehicle on the road, whether the driver behind the wheel had ever heard of it or not. A generation earlier, each of those 3 trades, guns, tyres, electrical fittings, would have been a dozen small firms scattered across a dozen streets. Now each was one firm, one gate, one payroll office. Herbert Austin was born in 1866. In 1905, he founded the Austin Motor Company at Longbridge on the southern edge of the city and began building cars under his own name. In 1922, the company introduced the Austin 7, a car priced cheaply enough that it put Britain, for the first time, on wheels. Not the wealthy alone, but clerks, doctors, shopkeepers, the ordinary buyer the earlier motor trade had never designed for. Longbridge grew with the industry it had helped invent, until the plant itself was closer to a small town than a factory. At its peak, in the late 1960s, the plant employed some 25,000 people. 25,000 on one site, building one thing, answering one whistle. Hold that number, it will not stay 25,000. By the early 1970s, the West Midlands built roughly 60% of every car made in Britain. Not a majority of cars in one region among several. Most of the cars in the country, full stop. Nobody in London needed to confer the title. Birmingham had simply become the fact of it, the motor city of a country that had never quite had one before, and the math of it was straightforward. A place that had once run on 1,000 independent trades now ran, in large part, on cars. Cadbury, BSA, Dunlop, Lucas, Austin. 5 names were now doing what 1,000 small trades had once done between them, scattered across 10,000 benches and back rooms and courtyard workshops in the toy trade's old streets. The bucklemaker's stall and the toymaker's bench had given way to the assembly line, the payroll ledger, the whistle that called 17,000 people to work at the same hour instead of 1,000 independent masters opening their own doors when they pleased. Birmingham had not stopped being a workshop. It had simply built a handful of them enormous and put the whole of the old city of trades onto their payrolls. 1,000 trades had become 5. Chapter 6. The Concrete Collar. 1,000 trades had become 5. And then, very quietly, the city that had spent 2 centuries consolidating its workshops turned on the workshop city itself. The actual streets, the actual brick, the actual squares 1,000 trades had built, and began pulling it down. Nothing about it looked like a collapse. It looked at the time like planning. The man doing the pulling had been in position for a long time already. Herbert Manzoni became Birmingham city engineer in 1935 and held the post until 1963, and somewhere across those years he designated roughly 1,400 acres of the city for redevelopment. Of the Victorian Birmingham he was clearing, the Birmingham of the civic gospel, the Birmingham an American journalist had once called the best governed city in the world, Manzoni said there was little of real worth in our architecture. He didn't offer it as an insult. He offered it as an engineering finding, filed and acted upon, acre by acre, block by block. By 1971, the council owned 464 tower blocks, standing on ground his department had cleared, concrete replacing whatever had stood there before. The courtyard workshops, the back-to-back housing, the crowded, mismatched, improvised skyline that 1,000 trades had assembled without a single planning document. In its place rose blocks of a uniform height, built to a uniform specification, by a council convinced it was correcting a slum rather than erasing a city. Where the old Victorian markets had once done their trade, an indoor shopping complex called the Bull Ring Centre opened in 1964. A single enclosed building where generations of open stalls had stood, roofed over, tidied up, made orderly. Then came the road. Built from 1957 and opened in 1971, the inner ring road circled the city centre in a loop of dual carriageway, and it earned a nickname almost immediately: the Concrete Collar. Not a metaphorical collar, an actual one, tightening around the centre it had been built to serve. It strangled the centre inward, penning it against its own loop. It strangled the growth that might have spread outward past it, and it strangled the centre off from what lay just beyond the loop, including the jewellery quarter, the district that had gone on hammering rings and chains through everything Birmingham had already lived, and would go on hammering long after everything around it had stopped. The collar never touched the jewellery quarter directly. It simply cut it off from the city it belonged to, a district built for walking now stranded on the far side of a road built for cars. The era's low point did not come from a plan at all. On the 21st of November 1974, 2 pub bombings, carried out by the Provisional IRA, killed 21 people in Birmingham. Many more were injured. It stands as one of the deadliest attacks in British history. In the investigation that followed, 6 men were wrongfully convicted of the bombings, men who became known as the Birmingham Six. The city that had built the civic gospel, that had once measured its own profit in the health of its people, absorbed this and went on, the way cities do. None of it began with a factory closing. That would come later, loudly, in headlines and unemployment figures anyone could read. This began earlier and quieter than that, with a city engineer who found little of real worth in the buildings around him, with a ring road that solved a traffic problem by strangling the thing it circled, with a shopping centre standing where a market had traded since before anyone living could remember it otherwise. Birmingham had spent 2 centuries building itself with no one's permission. Now, acre by acre, it was taking itself apart with just as little debate, and no one called it a fall. It was called redevelopment. It was called progress. It was called, simply, a correction. The tower blocks stood on cleared ground. The ring road closed around the centre. The jewellery quarter kept hammering just outside the collar, the one district the wrecking ball never quite reached. Chapter 7. The Quiet Collapse. And then, quietly, the industry that had built the West Midlands began to be run by other people, in other places. The consolidation came first, and it came as paperwork. In 1952, the maker of Longbridge's cars was folded into the British Motor Corporation. One merger among many meant to save money by making fewer decisions in more places at once. In 1968, the corporation itself was folded again into British Leyland, a single company assembled out of a dozen brands that had spent decades competing with each other and were now expected overnight to cooperate. Longbridge did not vanish in that reorganisation, not yet, but it became a plant managed from London, one line in a portfolio nobody at the top had built by hand. The losses did not slow. Fewer decisions made in fewer places were supposed to mean fewer losses. They did not. By 1975, the Ryder Report had confirmed what the accounts already showed, and British Leyland passed, in all but name, into the ownership of the state. The company that had once built cars under its own name now built them under the state's. Then the state decided it did not want that either. BSA had built guns, it had built bicycles, it had built the largest motorcycle company on Earth. In 1973, it built its last motorcycle, and then it built nothing. Through the 1980s, unemployment in parts of Birmingham reached about 40%. Not the whole city, but the parts that had been built around one trade and had nothing to fall back on once that trade stopped hiring. The shrinking did not stop when the decade did. Decade by decade, the list of what the city still made grew shorter. It simply moved more slowly, year over year, trade over trade, until manufacturing by 2012 accounted for roughly 8% of the jobs in a city that had once made 1,000 trades its name. The city that had needed workers for every kind of metal now needed them for almost none. Rover went the same way, in slower motion and with a sharper final number. British Aerospace bought it in 1988. BMW bought it in 1994 for £800 million, a price that still assumed a future. BMW tried to make the arithmetic work and did not. 6 years later, in 2000, the part of the business that still made ordinary cars for ordinary buyers was sold again to the Phoenix Consortium for a nominal £10. £800 million and then 10. Not a devaluation, a verdict. The company that emerged from that second sale was called MG Rover. It would not last 5 years. MG Rover collapsed into administration on the 8th of April 2005. About 6,000 jobs went with it and debts of more than £1 billion. The four directors who had run the company, known afterwards simply as the Phoenix Four, had presented themselves as saviours when they bought the company for that nominal sum in 2000. In the years it was failing, they took some £42 million out of the business. Longbridge, which had employed 25,000 people at its late 1960s peak, was down to a few hundred workers by 2014. 25,000, a few hundred. Hold both numbers side by side, that is the whole of it. The last collapse produced no factory floor, no picket line, no single day of layoffs to report. On the 5th of September 2023, Birmingham City Council issued a Section 114 notice. A Section 114 notice is not bankruptcy in the strict language of English law, but in every practical sense, it functions as exactly that. A legal freeze on new spending, a formal admission that the money had run out. It faced an equal pay liability of up to £760 million. It was carrying a computer system commissioned from Oracle, whose cost had climbed from £19 million toward more than £100 million, delivering less at every stage than it had promised. This was the same council that had bought the city's gas and its water in 1875 on the strength of its own confidence, and had been called by an American journalist who came to see it for himself the best governed city in the world. The best governed city in the world was bankrupt. Chapter 8: What Remains. By the 2021 census, Birmingham's population had reached 1,144,900, the highest figure the city has ever recorded. Not since 1951, when the count stood at 1,112,685, had Birmingham announced a record population, and this was a different record, in a different city. It is now the largest city proper in England outside London, and by that same census, a young city and a majority-minority city, its residents on average younger than the national figure, no single group any longer a majority within its own boundaries. The council that governed all of them had, 2 years earlier, told the courts it could not pay its bills. In the 2 years after the Section 114 notice, that same council cut services by £300 million. It moved to sell more than £1 billion in municipal assets. It raised council tax by 21% in a single year. It put 25 libraries on a list of buildings that might have to close. None of it arrived as a single crisis. It arrived as a schedule. A budget line changed at a time, a service reduced at a time, a library added to the list at a time, the sort of contraction that looks month to month almost administrative. A city holding more people than it had ever held before was, at the same time, doing less for them than it had done in living memory. And still, Birmingham built. The Bullring was rebuilt in 2003. Its new Selfridges store wrapped in the discs that made the skyline unmistakable from the motorway, silver and faintly reflective, laid over the building's curved shell like scales. The Library of Birmingham opened in 2013 at a cost of nearly £190 million, the kind of sum a solvent city spends on ambition rather than survival. In 2022, the Commonwealth Games arrived, and for a few weeks the eyes of the world were on a Birmingham that was, by then, less than a year from declaring it could not pay its own bills. Ambition and insolvency, it turned out, were not mutually exclusive. The city ran both books at once. Some of what the city built along the way is still standing, repurposed rather than demolished. Bolton's house at Soho, where the Lunar Society once gathered by moonlight, is a museum now, open to visitors who can walk through the rooms where Bolton and Watt and Priestley argued past midnight. The canals that once carried coal and iron and finished ormolu still hold water. The same water Brindley's Birmingham Canal had first carried coal on in 1769. But the traffic on them now is narrowboats, tourists drifting past Gas Street Basin and the bars of Brindley Place, where warehouses used to stand. Spaghetti Junction, the motorway interchange that opened at Gravelly Hill in 1972, was poured directly over those same canals and rivers, the water that had made the city possible running now in the shadow of the concrete built to replace it. The boats still pass beneath it, into daylight and back into shadow on the same water Brindley threaded through the town by hand. The jewellery quarter still works. More than 800 businesses operate inside it, and between them they still produce something like 40% of all the jewellery made in Britain. In 2025 it was named a World Craft City, a title reserved for places where a trade has survived in continuous, working form, rather than as a memory behind glass. The gun trade is gone. The pen trade is gone. The car plants are gone. The 25,000 jobs at Longbridge reduced decades ago to a few hundred. The city of 1,000 trades has been reduced to essentially one, and it survives in the same small workshops. Behind the same brick facades the ring road never quite reached. On the same square mile of streets it has occupied since before the toy trade had a name. It is the last living piece of the model the whole city once ran on. Hundreds of small benches, no factory gate, no single owner. The same model Birmingham worked by before Bolton ever leased his 13 acres at Soho. Not hundreds of small fires now, all going at once. One fire still going in the historic square mile the wrecking ball never touched.